If your education was anything like mine, you probably learned an awful lot about the Nazis. You will have learned about how they killed millions in the death camps of the Holocaust, how Hitler was a fanatical leader that started the biggest war in human history. In contrast, you will have spent a vanishingly small amount of time on communism. Perhaps it was mentioned that Stalin was also evil and also killed millions of his own citizens. Perhaps you learned a little bit about the gulags or the purges. In my case, almost no time at all was spent on Mao's China. Then, if you were anything like me, a few years later you might have heard the claim that communism actually killed more people than fascism, perhaps even up to 100 million people. How could that have happened, I remember thinking. I knew that the Nazis had killed around 6 million Jews in the Holocaust. Could communism really have killed more than 10 times as many? How exactly did they die? I knew how fascism killed people, in death camps such as Auschwitz, but how exactly did they die under communism? In this video, I want to explain that. Here is a rough breakdown of the deaths due to communism, put into 3 categories: famine, labour camps, and direct violence. Now I'm going to go through them one by one. Since they caused the most deaths, we'll start with famine. As you can see, the number of people that died due to famine is absolutely incomparable to any other cause, and for that reason I'll spend the bulk of the video talking about it. The famines that happened under communism are absolutely mind-boggling. Communist Russia had 2 horrific famines, one in the early 20s and another in the early 30s. Together they killed about 12 million people. Communist China had only one major famine, but it was by far the worst famine in human history. It killed potentially up to 50 million people. That's more than double the next worst famine in history. So, why did the famines happen, and can they really be blamed on the communist policies? My goal in this section is to persuade you that yes, the communist policies absolutely were to blame. It was primarily due to a process known as collectivization of agriculture. That could also be called nationalization of agriculture. Others have also called it the enslavement of the peasantry.
1928 is when Stalin makes the decision to collectivize agriculture, or that is to enslave the peasantry, 100 million plus people.
Essentially, it was the process of getting rid of all private property in farming so that agriculture would be done entirely by the state. Nobody could own any farmland as all of it belonged to the state. Any food that anybody produced didn't belong to them, it belonged to the state. Of course, that meant that it would be the state that would decide how food was distributed, to which regions was food sent, and how much did each town or village get. Another absolutely crucial question is which regions would be the food producing regions, and most importantly, how much would they be expected to provide for the rest of the country. All of that was to be decided centrally by state bureaucrats. The buying and selling of food had to be prohibited. For the farmers, the product of their labour, the food that they produced, didn't belong to them. That is why it's been called enslavement. That process, more than anything else, is what caused the famines. The need for collectivization comes directly from the communist ideology. The minute that you allow farmers to own the food that they produce or sell it, you have capitalism. To have true communism, all free trade has to be banned. If it's not, people will immediately start producing things and trading them. Before you know it, capitalism has slipped in through the back door. For committed communists such as Mao and Stalin, that was totally intolerable. That is why the collectivization of agriculture was essential to creating the communist utopia. So, why did the collectivization of agriculture produce such horrific famines? To explain that, we need to take a closer look at what it looked like in practice. I'm going to start with how things happened in communist Russia. Up until 1917, farming in Russia was done by a complex system of serfs and wealthy peasants that were known as kulaks. I'll talk more about kulaks later, but for now they were essentially peasants that had got a bit entrepreneurial and managed their land more effectively. That allowed them to make more money and grow their farms. Then, in 1917, the communists took power, and what ensued was a brutal civil war that took several years for them to win. If you would like to learn more about that, please do see the video that I made on it. It was during that civil war that the communists made their first movements towards collectivizing agriculture in what was known as war communism. There were many different aspects to war communism: nationalization of industries, military control of the railways, but the most important for us in this video was the confiscation of grain from farmers. That was exactly what it sounds like. Peasants were forced to surrender the food that they had produced. Essentially, some government goons would turn up at a farm and force the peasants to hand over their grain. That grain was then distributed as the communists saw fit. Of course, much of it went to their army to win the civil war. Many peasants resisted. They hid their grain and ate their livestock. Some even took up arms. In the region of Tambov, peasants forcibly took back the confiscated grain and started an armed rebellion against the government. Of course, the communists cracked down extremely harshly. There were brutal punishments, such as mass arrests and executions, deportations, and forced labor camps. Now, I should say that that wasn't full-on collectivization of agriculture, because the vast majority of the land remained in private hands. Collectivization of agriculture really means when all of the land is owned and managed by the state. At that point in the early 1920s, food was still mainly produced by private individuals, but the state would then confiscate it. The results were devastating. Many regions had to surrender all their grain, leaving them with nothing. Millions died of starvation. The cities lost a huge amount of population as people fled to the countryside in the hope of feeding themselves. Petrograd and Moscow both lost over half their population. The famine was such a disaster for the communists that they were eventually forced to do a U-turn. The policy of grain confiscation was stopped and replaced with a food tax, which allowed the peasants to trade the grain that they produced. Free markets and capitalism were back, at least in the countryside. That immediately led to an increase in production, as the peasants now had an incentive to produce more. For the next few years, Russia continued with that sort of hybrid system, with communism in the cities, but capitalism and free markets in the countryside. That worked to prevent any further famines for the rest of the 1920s. So, the communists had made a first attempt at collectivizing agriculture, and it had gone spectacularly badly. You would hope that that would mean that they would learn from their mistake and not try it again. That is not what happened. The communists were committed to their dream. They hated capitalism and were determined to eradicate it. While their previous attempt had been a disaster, that was no reason not to try again. Enter Joseph Stalin. Stalin came to power in the 1920s and was determined to get agriculture collectivized once and for all. This time they were going to do it properly. They weren't just going to confiscate the grain of the peasants. They were going to get all of the land under government control. All food would be produced in state-run farms. The process began in the late 1920s, and the speed at which it happened was astonishing. In October of 1929, about 7% of peasants were working in state-run farms. Only 4 months later, that was up to 50%. Now, if government ownership of land goes from 7% to 50% in 4 months, you might be thinking, well, what happened to all the people who owned the land before? I would love to tell you that they just had their land stolen from them and were forced to work on it as before. The truth is actually much worse than that. In fact, they were essentially the victims of genocide. Those better off land-owning peasants were known as kulaks. They were entrepreneurial peasants that had run their businesses effectively and managed to grow their wealth over time. The communists, of course, hated them and encouraged resentment amongst other peasants. The word kulak is actually a negative label that those people were branded. It literally means fist and alludes to the same idea as the phrase tight-fisted in English. Those people were said to have got where they had through exploitation. In truth, they had achieved their well-to-do position by being more competent, successful farmers. Eventually, the kulaks were made official class enemies of the Soviet Union and targeted brutally. In December of 1929, Stalin called for, quote-unquote, the liquidation of the kulaks as a class. He said, now we have the opportunity to carry out a resolute offensive against the kulaks, break their resistance, eliminate them as a class, and replace their production with the production of state farms. Those people, just for being relatively wealthy, were either to be executed or sent to forced labor camps. Up to 5 million people died. It was an official government policy of class-based genocide. On the land that had been expropriated from the kulaks, state-run farms were set up that were run by the government. Those farms would be run by officials from the Communist Party who often didn't know anything about farming. Virtually everything that the farm produced it was obliged to sell to the state for a very low price. Conditions for the workers were very poor. Wages were often months late, and food and clothing were terrible. Given that there wasn't enough food to go around even in the better years, people would often try to eat the food that they were producing. That was severely and violently punished. People also tried to get more food by having their own allotments. That was of course illegal, so had to be done in secret. Under communism, producing anything for your own consumption has to be illegal. People weren't even allowed to leave the jobs or move to a different region. There was actually internal passports that were used to stop anyone travelling that wasn't allowed to. In that sense, it was like slavery or serfdom. The workers weren't paid more or less depending on how much they produced, so their motivation to work was to avoid the punishments of not working hard enough. There weren't official punishments for not working. What happened was that people that weren't working hard enough would be accused of sabotage or stealing and subject to violence. The collectivization went on to cause an enormous famine that killed up to 9 million people. However, the question remains, why exactly did that happen? What about the collectivization caused the famine? The first and most simple answer is that production fell. That was for many reasons. First, the government had stripped land from the most productive farmers and put it under the control of government officials that had no experience of farming. The kulaks had become wealthy precisely because they were the most productive and competent farmers. By killing and exiling them, Russia had got rid of its best farmers. Another huge factor was that the new system eliminated the peasants' incentive to work hard to produce more. Don't forget the peasants didn't own what they produced. If they worked harder and produced more, they wouldn't get any benefit from it. When we look at the numbers, we do see that there was a fall in food production, but it wasn't actually that extreme. Essentially, food production fell from about 84 million tons in 1930 to 70 million tons in the next 3 years. However, in particular regions, the drop was much more severe. Particularly badly hit was Ukraine. There, production fell by an enormous 25%, from about 24 million tons to 18 million. Now, while that drop in production was significant, it definitely wasn't the whole story. That drop in food production was dramatically exacerbated by other decisions that the government took, in particular how it decided to allocate the food. Under capitalism, no individual controls the allocation of food. Food is distributed by a decentralized system of voluntary trade between people, what Adam Smith famously called the invisible hand. Under communism, that distribution is entirely determined by state officials. Essentially, it's the job of some government bureaucrat to decide how much food goes to each region. Those officials also have to decide how food is going to get from the net producing regions to the net consuming regions. Of course, in any society, it's necessary for there to be a net movement of food from the agricultural areas where it's produced to the areas where it isn't, such as the cities. Under capitalism, that happens through a decentralized process where farmers sell their produce to areas that need it. Under communism, how grain is distributed within a society is decided by the government. The government decides whether a region is going to be a net producer or a net consumer of grain, and by how much. For agricultural regions such as Ukraine, that would basically mean that they would be forced to hand over a certain amount of grain to the central government to be sent to other areas of the country. They would then be expected to feed themselves on what they had left over after the grain was taken. Now that might just about function when harvests are good and Ukraine has enough grain to feed itself and hand over a large amount. But what happens when production falls, as it did in the early 1930s? Remember, Ukraine's production fell by about 25%. Surely then the amount of grain that it's expected to export would need to decrease dramatically. Potentially, for those years, Ukraine should even be a net importer of grain from the rest of the country. That is not what happened. Despite producing a much lower quantity of grain, Ukraine was still forced to export the same amount to the rest of the country, about 8 million tons. That had been manageable when Ukraine was producing 24 million tons, but when that fell to just 18 million, it was catastrophic. It doesn't take a genius to work out what happened next. An enormous famine with up to 5 million deaths. It was due to that lethal combination of a dramatic fall in production coupled with the requirement to continue exporting a fixed amount of grain to other areas of Russia. That is how you end up with a situation where, paradoxically, the Ukraine, a fertile and food-producing region, is worse affected by the famine than, for instance, an urban environment like Moscow. Like previously, people tried to move to areas least affected by the famine, which the government tried to stop. Again, internal passports were used to stop people moving to the cities. In January of 1933 alone, about 200,000 Ukrainian peasants were caught trying to escape the famine and sent back to their villages. The majority were being sent to their deaths. Also unforgivable is that not only was the government forcibly exporting grain from Ukraine to other parts of Russia, but it was exporting it to other countries. The government did cut the exports, but not completely. In 1932, years into the famine, the government exported 1.5 million tons of grain, about 2% of the overall harvest. That grain would have helped enormously in the hardest hit areas. There is actually a debate between historians about whether the famine in Ukraine was deliberate. Some people claim that Stalin wanted to punish Ukraine for having a nationalist movement that wasn't entirely committed to the Soviet Union. Others say that there isn't evidence that it was deliberate. What is certain is that Stalin and the Russian leadership were aware of the famine and didn't care or act fast to alleviate the situation. By the mid-1930s, the situation had improved and the worst of the famine was over. The disaster of collectivization had damaged Stalin politically, but he had managed to do it. That famine in the early 1930s was the biggest in the Soviet Union. There was another one in 1946, which killed perhaps 2 million people, but the worst of it was over. By that time, communist famines had killed roughly 15 million people. I would love to tell you that that was the last of the victims of famine, but in fact, at that point, communist famines had killed only a quarter of their total victims. Tens of millions more were to die overwhelmingly in China, in what became the worst famine the world has ever seen. The communists came to power in China through a similar process to that of Russia. Led by Mao Zedong, they won a brutal civil war from 1945 to 49. Like the leaders of communist Russia, Mao and his followers were determined to implement communism as completely as they could. That would mean that the people of China, like the people of Russia, were going to experience the joy of trying to collectivize agriculture. The process started in 1953, only 4 years after the communists had taken power. The government declared that all surplus grain had to be sold to the state for a fixed price. As with the Soviet Union, the rules about quotas were used to cause all sorts of misery for the peasants. In reality, there wasn't really any surplus grain. The peasants were barely scraping by. Of course, it was the government that got to define what counted as surplus grain. They determined that it was anything above 15 kilograms per person per month, a little over half of what a person needs to eat in order to get sufficient calories. All grain that a village had above that level had to be sold to the state for a fixed price. The fact that the villagers weren't able to keep enough grain to feed themselves was actually a feature, not a bug. It made them more dependent on the state. Any extra grain that they needed had to be bought from the state based on how well they contributed to collective labor. It's important to note that food was still largely produced in private farms, but then confiscated by the state. In late 1953, less than 1% of farms were collective. The vast majority were private. Like in the Soviet Union, the Chinese Communist Party didn't want to have just the state taking grain from private farms. They wanted to abolish private farms entirely, to have all farming done by the state. Initially, that process began simply with the government encouraging violence towards landlords. Mao encouraged peasants to kill landowners, whose land would then be turned into state-run farms. Virtually all of the pre-existing landlord class was stripped of their assets and killed. Up to 5 million former landlords were killed or exiled. The process began on a much bigger scale in 1955. By 1958, the vast majority of farming in China was done in state-run farms. The majority of the peasants didn't have enough to eat, but there wasn't a full-on famine. That would change in 1958. Mao wanted to embark on an enormous program called, ironically, the Great Leap Forward. It encompassed a whole load of policies, many of them absolutely mental and with horrific consequences. One of Mao's most bonkers policies was to get the peasants making steel. China needed more steel if it was going to be able to keep up with the advanced capitalist countries. He wanted to get all the peasants to try their hand at steelmaking at home. That went about as well as you would imagine. The peasants didn't know what they were doing since they didn't have any experience producing steel and they didn't have the equipment that they needed. The peasants were to produce steel out of scrap metal in small wood-burning furnaces. The steel produced was of low quality and not useful for anything. Anyone who knew anything about steel production would have been able to predict that, but Mao didn't like experts. Also, people were worried that if they criticized the plan, they would be killed, so nobody did anything. The DIY steel production also took precious time and energy away from food production. Peasants were actually told to prioritize producing steel over producing food. Another of Mao's fantastic ideas was to launch a war against pests. One of the pests that he sought to eliminate was sparrows. Sparrows were believed to steal large amounts of grain, so they were shot and their nests destroyed. That totally backfired. The sparrows were actually playing an important role in keeping down the population of much more destructive pests, locusts. With the sparrows gone, the locust population soared, leading to enormous crop losses. Those crazy policies led to a significant drop in grain production. As you can see, there was a 30% drop from 1958 to 1960. Given that even in 1958 the majority of people weren't getting enough calories, that drop was always going to cause widespread hunger. However, just like in the Soviet Union, that drop in production was massively exacerbated by other terrible policies. Rules about how grain was allocated meant that it was taken from where it was needed and given to where it wasn't. It was in large part due to the surplus system and the incentive structure that it gave rise to amongst the Communist Party officials. Essentially, if you were the Communist Party official in charge of a particular region, one of the ways that you could gain kudos and advance your career was by having your region produce a really big surplus of grain to be exported to the rest of China. If your region was producing enough grain to feed itself and export tons of grain to the rest of China, that showed that you must be running it well and the collective farms must be being productive. It doesn't take a genius to work out what happened next. The officials wanted to report the biggest surpluses that they could, so they would squeeze their regions for absolutely everything that they had. The more of the grain that you let your region keep to feed itself, the lower the surplus that you would be able to report to the Communist Party HQ. The officials didn't leave their regions with anywhere near enough grain to feed themselves, and so people starved. The resulting famine was, to put it simply, the worst in human history, and it's not even close. There were more than 40 million deaths, more than twice as many as the second worst famine in history. So, famines were by far the biggest reason that people died under communism. However, they were far from the only cause. Tens of millions also died from forced labor camps, political purges, and massacres. First, I'll talk about labor camps. In communist Russia, the labor camps were known as gulags, and there were hundreds of them. Roughly 18 million people were sent to one at some point in their lives, of which about 1.5 million died. Conditions were as horrific as you would imagine. One Soviet official described them as such. Among the prisoners, there were some so ragged and lice-ridden that they pose a sanitary danger to the rest. These prisoners have deteriorated to the point of losing any resemblance to human beings. Lacking food, they eat rats and dogs. Gulags were the primary form of prison in communist Russia. Fear of being sent to one stopped people criticizing the regime. Even being suspected of being against communism was enough to get you sent to one. Those tactics terrorized the population. One woman who lived in the 1920s wrote about the experience. "At home, we never talked about politics or anything like that," she said. "Father always said, 'The walls have ears.' Once he even showed us how to hear our neighbor's conversation by listening through a glass against the wall. Then we understood. From then on, we too were afraid of our neighbors." The Russian gulags effectively ended with the death of Stalin in 1953. Much less is known about the prison camps in China, likely because the regime that set them up is still in charge and prevents the study of them. They function very much the same as the labor camps in Russia. Prisoners were used as slave labor to make anything from tea to coal. The conditions were of course horrific and huge numbers died. We don't know exactly how many. Estimates range from 15 to 30 million. The final way that I'm going to talk about people dying under communism was due to direct violence. That took many forms, from purges of political opponents to peasant-on-peasant massacres. I talked earlier about the mass killings of wealthy peasants known as kulaks in communist Russia. Up to 5 million may have died. There was also Stalin's famous purge in the 1930s, which killed about 1 million people. In that episode, the majority of the victims were actually members of government. Stalin murdered his military officers, his diplomats, his intelligence officials, his party officials. It's important to emphasize that those were the elites, the people most loyal to Stalin and the regime. Those were the people who stuck with Stalin throughout the disastrous collectivization of agriculture. The Great Purge is actually quite difficult to explain. It's not totally clear why Stalin did it. One possible explanation is that Stalin wanted to break the will of his inner circle. Up until that point, many of those surrounding Stalin had been willing to debate him and have their own ideas. After the Great Purge, those people were psychologically broken and many committed suicide. Stalin was ramping up the level of fear amongst those around him and demonstrating his power. One of the unique aspects of the purge was the emphasis on obtaining confessions from people before they were executed. It wasn't enough just to kill someone. Stalin wanted them to confess to crimes that they hadn't committed. He was directly involved in that. He would receive drafts of the confessions before they were made public and even edit them, adding information about imaginary crimes. An example of this is the case of a man called Mikhail Tukhachevsky. He was one of the most senior army officers and their most talented military commander. He had played a key role in winning the Russian Civil War for the communists. Tukhachevsky was forced to confess that he was a German spy. That was, of course, preposterous, but it served its purpose. His handwritten confession still exists on blood-stained paper from where he was tortured. Why did Stalin do that? The confessions were useful as they legitimized the arrests and the executions. It also increased the number of people that were arrested, as each suspect was forced to name accomplices, and they too could then be arrested. The confessions were also useful to generate fear and suspicion amongst the common people. The message was that there are enemies of Russia everywhere, that you could trust nobody, except of course Stalin himself. In communist China, there were many massacres of many different types. Some of them were political purges, similar to Stalin's Great Purge. Others were non-political mass killings, often common people killing other common people. Here is a list from Wikipedia of those that happened between 1949 and 66. As you can see, there was a huge amount of violence during the Great Famine and the collectivization of agriculture. About 2.5 million of the deaths were due to violence. The first entry about land reform was essentially the Chinese equivalent of the massacre of the kulaks in Russia. It was where the communist government encouraged peasants to kill the former landlords of the old regime. The campaign to suppress revolutionaries and the anti-rightist campaign were, as the name suggests, essentially political purges. Anyone suspected of being against communism was targeted with violence. As you can see, millions died. A huge number of people also died in what is known as the Cultural Revolution that started in 1966. It was more than just a purge, it was an attempt to fully transform society. Its stated goal was to preserve Chinese communism by purging remnants of capitalist and traditional elements from Chinese society. Mao launched the revolution saying that bourgeois elements had infiltrated the government and society with the aim of restoring capitalism. He called for the population to kill anyone that might have sympathies towards capitalism or tradition. The people were more than happy to oblige. Much of the violence was actually carried out by students. They formed paramilitaries that were known as the Red Guard and given free rein to root out enemies of the revolution. They were to target what were known as the Four Olds. That was old ideas, old culture, old customs, and old habits. As you can see, it was an assault on tradition as much as capitalism. Ancient artifacts and graves of notable Chinese figures were destroyed. The Cultural Revolution also saw what were known as struggle sessions. Those were public humiliation and interrogation sessions where individuals were subjected to verbal abuse and violence. During a struggle session, the accused would be brought before a crowd of colleagues, neighbours, or even family members. They would be forced to confess to their alleged crimes, which would range from holding bourgeois ideas to engaging in counter-revolutionary activities or betraying the revolution. The goal of these sessions was to publicly shame the accused, break their will, and reaffirm the authority of Mao and the Communist Party. Those who resisted or failed to confess sufficiently might face further punishment or be subjected to repeated sessions until they complied. There was also straight-up mass killing. One of the most famous examples was the Guangxi massacre, where about 500,000 people were killed. People were beheaded, buried alive, boiled and drowned. One of the most bizarre aspects of the Guangxi massacre was that there was a significant amount of cannibalism, with about 400 people eaten. I should stress that that wasn't due to famine or lack of food. The Cultural Revolution saw many such massacres in different parts of China. In total, up to 2 million people may have been killed. So far in the video, I've spoken almost entirely about China and Russia, and while those two are the most important communist countries, they're far from the only ones. One of the worst massacres in communist history actually happened in Cambodia. It was very similar to the purges in Russia and China. The Communist Party, known as the Khmer Rouge, wanted to get rid of anyone that was opposed to the revolution. They believed that the cities were filled with bourgeois elements that needed to be purged to create their ideal classless society. They forcibly evacuated Cambodia's cities, sending millions of people to rural labor camps in what became known as killing fields. Those that showed any sign of being an intellectual were most brutally targeted, such as doctors, religious figures, or even those who wore glasses. Many were executed outright, while others died from starvation, disease, or overwork. In total, about 2 million people died, about a quarter of the country's population. So, that is an overview of all the ways that people have died in communist regimes. How can we sum up? Well, I think the main thing that I want to impress upon you is that while the purges and the labour camps were probably more famous, it's actually the famines that killed most people in communist societies. Those famines were the direct result of communist policies, that lethal combination of a drop in production combined with regions being forced to export large amounts of grain to other regions even when they needed it. We can only hope and pray that humanity has learned its lesson and will never again try communism.